The lights went out at exactly 9 o'clock, the way they always did on this station, and I lay still in the dark, counting my own heartbeat, the way I had been taught to do since I was a small girl back on Earth. 1, 2, 3. My roommate, a tall silver-skinned girl named Yola, was already breathing slow and even in the bunk across from mine. She trusted the dark. I never did. My name is Elena Brooks, and I am the only human on this entire research station, 3 jumps away from any world that would call itself home. They brought me here 2 years ago, officially as a guest of the Halvin Cultural Exchange Program, though everyone on this station knew the truth. I was not a guest. I was a specimen, and specimens do not get to leave when they want to. I had learned to live with the stairs in the hallways, the way conversations stopped when I walked past, the way the guards outside my door changed shifts every 6 hours, like they were watching something dangerous, instead of a girl who stood a full head shorter than most of them. I had learned to smile at the scientists who studied my blood pressure and my reflexes, and wrote notes about how strange it was that my body healed so fast. I had learned all of this, and none of it had ever felt like enough. Tonight felt different. It started as a small thing, the kind of small thing you only notice if you have spent your whole life noticing small things. The air in my room shifted, just slightly, like a door somewhere down the corridor had opened when it should not have. The station always hummed with the low sound of its engines and its air filters, a sound so constant that most people forgot it was even there. But I had spent 2 years memorizing that hum, the way a musician memorizes a favorite song, and tonight, for just a moment, the pitch of it changed. I did not move. I did not open my eyes any wider than they already were. I simply listened. There it was again, footsteps, not the heavy, deliberate steps of the guards who patrolled this section every hour. These were lighter, careful, spaced out like someone was counting the seconds between them on purpose. Someone who did not want to be heard. My heart did not race. That surprised me a little, even in the moment, because I had always imagined that if something like this ever happened, I would feel afraid first, and clear-headed second. Instead, it was the opposite. My mind went sharp and quiet, the way it used to back home when I was a girl running through the hills near my grandfather's farm, learning to read the world around me before the world had a chance to surprise me. I thought about Yola, still asleep across the room, and I hoped whatever was coming was not coming for her. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. I had exactly 4 seconds before the door opened, and in those 4 seconds, I did what I have always done in moments like this. I planned. My eyes moved across the room without turning my head, mapping every object I could reach without standing up. The metal frame of my bunk, the small reading lamp on the shelf, unplugged and useless as a light, but heavy enough to matter. The chair by the narrow desk where I had once tried, and failed, to write letters to a family that could never receive them. The door did not creak. Whoever was on the other side of it had clearly studied this station's layout, had clearly planned for silence. It slid open just wide enough for a shape to slip through, dark against the dim emergency lighting of the hallway beyond. I kept my eyes almost closed, my breathing slow and even, mimicking sleep the way I had practiced 100 times without ever expecting to need it for real. Through the thin slits of my eyelids I watched the shape move closer, low and careful, and behind it, a second shape entered, and then a third. 3 of them, at least, maybe more waiting outside. They were Halvin, tall and lean like most of the station's crew, their skin catching just enough of the emergency light to shine faintly silver blue in the dark. They moved with the confidence of people who had done this before, who expected no trouble from the small, soft-smelling creature curled up in the bunk in front of them. I understood then, in that strange, clear-headed way that fear sometimes gives you instead of taking away, that these were not station guards checking on a noise. These were not scientists coming for another late-night test. These were people who had come here to take me somewhere I would not choose to go. I felt something settle inside me, cold and steady, like a switch being thrown. It was not anger, not yet. It was simply readiness. The same readiness my ancestors must have felt standing in tall grass with something large and hungry moving through the shadows nearby. Humanity had spent a very long time learning how to survive nights like this one, long before we ever left our own world, long before anyone out here in the stars had ever heard our name. The closest shape reached toward my shoulder, slow and gentle, the way you might reach for something you did not want to startle awake. I let my eyes open the rest of the way. For just a heartbeat, the alien froze, his hand still hovering above my shoulder, his pale eyes catching the dim light as they met mine. I do not know what he saw in my face in that moment, whether it was fear or calm or something else entirely, but whatever it was, it made him hesitate. And in a place like this, on a night like this, hesitation is the only mistake that matters. I moved before he could pull his hand back. My fingers closed around his wrist, and I used his own weight against him, pulling him forward and down in one smooth motion I had practiced more times than I could count during long nights on this station when sleep would not come and my body needed something to do besides lie still and wait. He made a short surprise sound as he lost his balance, and behind him, the second shape lunged forward, faster than I expected, reaching for something at his belt. I rolled off the bunk and onto my feet in the same movement, putting the frame of my bed between us for just a second, enough time to see the outline of a small device in his hand, something that hummed faintly with a pale blue light. A device meant to make me sleep, not to harm me. They wanted me quiet. They wanted me easy to carry. They had not planned for me to be awake before the door even opened. Across the room, I heard Yola stir, her breath catching as she woke into a scene that must have made no sense to her at first. 3 intruders in the dark, and her quiet human roommate already on her feet, already moving. "Stay down," I said to her, my voice low and steady, surprising even myself with how calm it sounded. "Stay very still." She did not argue. I would learn later that something in my voice convinced her this was not a night for questions. The second Haven raised his device toward me, and I ducked low, letting it hum past where my head had been a moment before, striking the wall behind me instead. I felt the chair beside the desk under my hand, almost without thinking about reaching for it, my fingers finding the smooth metal leg like it had been waiting there just for me. The third shape, still near the door, said something sharp, in a language I only partly understood, a warning or a command, I could not tell which. But I understood the tone well enough. Things were not going the way they had planned. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I have told this story many times since that night, and people always expect it to sound bigger than it was. It did not feel big in the moment. It felt small and fast and precise, like every movement I had trained for my whole life without ever knowing exactly why, finally arriving all at once, exactly when I needed them. The first Halvin, the one who had reached for my shoulder, was already trying to rise from where he had stumbled. I did not give him the chance. A quick, controlled motion with the chair leg against the side of his arm sent his device skittering across the floor, and a second motion, low and sweeping, took his balance away entirely. He went down hard, not harmed beyond a bruise or two, but very clearly finished for the night. The second one hesitated, just for a moment, staring at his companion on the floor, as if his mind could not quite process what he was seeing. That moment was all I needed. I closed the distance between us before he could raise his device again, using the momentum of my own body the way I had been taught since I was young, redirecting his strength instead of matching it. He folded to the floor beside his companion, breathing hard but unharmed, more shocked than anything else. The third one, the one who had spoken from the doorway, took a step back into the hallway, his pale eyes wide, his earlier confidence completely gone. Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm began to chime, soft and rising, the kind of sound that meant more of them were coming. I stood there in the dark of my small room, breathing hard, my heart finally beginning to race the way I had expected it to from the very start, and I understood, with a strange clarity that felt almost like relief, that this night had only just begun. Behind me, Yola whispered my name, her voice trembling. I did not turn around yet. My eyes were fixed on the open door, and on the shadow of the third intruder retreating down the hallway, and on the sound of more footsteps gathering somewhere beyond it, drawn by an alarm that was only going to make things louder before it made them quiet again. Whatever they had planned for tonight, I understood now that it had already gone wrong for them, and it was about to get much worse. I bent down, picked up the small humming device the first intruder had dropped, and turned it over slowly in my hand, studying it the way I studied everything unfamiliar, looking for its weakness the way I had once looked for the weakness in every obstacle life on Earth had ever put in front of me. Then I stepped toward the open door, toward the sound of the alarm and the footsteps and whatever was waiting for me beyond it, and for the first time since I had arrived on this station, I did not feel like a specimen at all. I felt like exactly what I was. The hallway outside my room was narrower than I remembered, and it felt even narrower now, with the emergency lights washing everything in a dim red glow. The third intruder had already vanished around the bend at the far end, his footsteps quick and uneven, no longer trying to stay quiet. He was running, and something about that told me he was not running to escape, he was running to warn the others. I did not chase him. I stepped back into my room instead, my mind moving faster than it ever had in my life, sorting through everything I had learned about this station over 2 long years. I knew where the guard posts were. I knew which corridors led to the docking bay and which ones led only to storage rooms with no way out. I knew, most importantly, that whoever had sent these 3 had almost certainly planned for more than 3. Yola was sitting up now, her back pressed against the wall of the bunk, her wide eyes moving between me and the 2 Halvan still on the floor near the door. Neither of them had gotten up yet. The first one groaned softly and tried to push himself onto his elbows, and I crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt beside him before he could rise any further. "Who sent you?" I said, keeping my voice low and even. "Tell me now, and this ends easier for you." He stared up at me, his pale eyes wide with something that looked almost like disbelief. I do not think he had ever imagined, even for a moment, that the small human girl from the research wing would be the one kneeling over him instead of the other way around. He said nothing, only turned his face away, and I understood that whatever fear was keeping his mouth shut, it was stronger than whatever fear I currently represented to him. That would not last long. I could already hear it changing in the room, in the way both of them refused to meet my eyes now, in the way their breathing had gone shallow and uneven. Fear has a way of arriving late, but staying long once it finally does. I looked over at Yola. "Is there a way to lock this door from the inside?" She nodded quickly, pointing toward a small panel near the frame. "There is an override, but it will only hold for a few minutes against a proper key." "A few minutes is enough," I said, and I meant it, though I was not entirely certain why I believed that. Something in me, some old and quiet certainty, told me that a few minutes was exactly the amount of time I would need. I moved to the panel and pressed the sequence Yola described, and the door slid shut with a soft hiss, sealing the 3 of us inside with the 2 fallen intruders. The alarm outside continued its slow, rising chime, filling the corridor beyond with a sound that would soon bring station security, and possibly bring more of whoever had sent this ambush in the first place. I turned back to the 2 Halvan on the floor. The second one, the one who had lunged for me with the sleep device, was watching me now with a different kind of attention, calculating rather than afraid. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone deciding whether to try again. I did not give him the chance to decide. I crossed the room and took the device from where it had fallen near the wall, turning it over once more in my hands before setting it firmly out of his reach on the shelf above the bunk. "You will not need this anymore," I told him, and something in my tone must have carried more weight than I intended, because he stopped watching me and simply lowered his eyes to the floor instead. Yola finally found her voice, though it came out thin and shaking. "Elena, what is happening? Why would anyone come for you like this?" I wished I had a better answer for her than the one I gave. I do not know yet, but I intend to find out. The truth was, I had my suspicions, and they had been growing quietly for months, long before tonight ever happened. There had been whispers among the research staff, conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room, reports filed about me that I was never allowed to read. I had always assumed the worst these whispers could produce was another round of tests, another set of scientists poking and measuring and writing notes in their careful, clinical handwriting. I had never imagined it would come to this. A sound at the door interrupted my thoughts, a heavy knock followed by a voice speaking rapid Halvan through the thin metal barrier. I did not understand every word, but I understood enough. Whoever was on the other side was not station security. The voice was too calm, too practiced, the kind of calm that belonged to someone used to giving orders in situations exactly like this one. "They will not wait long," Yola whispered, her eyes fixed on the door. She was right. A moment later, the panel beside the frame sparked, and the override I had set began to fail, the door groaning as something on the other side worked to force it open by more forceful means. I had perhaps 30 seconds before it gave way entirely. I looked around the small room one more time, cataloging everything within reach, the same way I had before the door first opened tonight. The chair leg I had already used sat on the floor near my feet. The reading lamp still sat on its shelf, unplugged and heavy, and there, near the two fallen Halvan, still clipped to the belt of the second one, was a second device, larger than the sleep tool, one I did not recognize. I moved quickly, kneeling beside him and working the device free from his belt before he could react. He tried to pull away, but there was very little strength left in him after everything that had already happened tonight, and the device came loose easily into my hand. It was heavier than I expected, its surface covered in small glowing symbols I could not read, but its shape was unmistakable even to someone who had never held anything like it before. It was a weapon, though what kind I could not yet say. The door groaned again, louder this time, the metal beginning to bend inward at the seam. "Behind the bunk," I told Yola, and this time she did not hesitate at all, scrambling to press herself into the narrow space between the bed frame and the wall, making herself as small as she could manage. I stood in the center of the room, the unfamiliar device in one hand and the chair leg in the other, and I waited. The door finally gave way, with a sharp crack, folding inward under the pressure of whatever tool had been used against it, and through the gap, 3 more shapes pushed their way into the room, their pale eyes adjusting quickly to the dim light within. Behind them I caught a glimpse of a 4th figure standing further back in the corridor, taller than the others, watching rather than entering, the way a commander watches a battle from a safe distance. I understood, in that moment, exactly what kind of night this had truly become. This was not a small operation gone wrong. This was something larger, something planned carefully, and expected to succeed without resistance, and I had already broken every part of that plan simply by being awake when I was supposed to be asleep. The nearest of the 3 new arrivals raised a device similar to the one I now held, its surface glowing with the same faint symbols, and I understood, without needing to be told, exactly what it was capable of. This was not a tool meant to make me sleep. This one was meant to stop me entirely, and stop me in a way from which I would not simply wake up bruised and shaken the next morning. I moved before he could aim it properly, closing the distance between us faster than his eyes could track, and I brought my forearm up hard against his wrist, sending the device spinning away from his grip and skittering across the floor toward the far wall. He staggered back in surprise, and I used the same motion to sweep his legs from beneath him, sending him down hard onto the floor beside his fallen companions. The second of the new arrivals reacted faster than the first, backing away instead of advancing, calling out something sharp toward the figure still watching from the corridor. I could not understand the words, but I understood the tone, a warning, an admission that this was no longer going according to plan. I did not give him time to retreat fully. I closed the gap between us before he could reach the doorway, using the chair leg to knock aside the device he tried to raise, and following with a quick, controlled strike that sent him stumbling back into the corridor wall, where he slid down slowly, dazed but not seriously hurt. That left only the 3rd new arrival, and the tall figure watching from further back. The 3rd one hesitated, glancing between his fallen companions, and the commanding figure behind him, clearly torn between finishing what he had come to do and simply running the way the very first intruder had run before him. I watched him make his decision in real time, watched the fear finally win out over whatever orders he had been given, and he turned and pushed past the commanding figure, disappearing further down the corridor without another word. That left only the tall figure standing at the edge of the doorway, still watching me with an expression I could not quite read in the dim red light. He did not carry a device in his hands the way the others had. He simply stood there, studying me the way I imagine a scientist studies something they had gravely underestimated. "You were not supposed to wake," he said finally, his voice low and careful, speaking in words I understood perfectly well, unlike the sharper commands his subordinates had used. "The reports on your species were very clear, soft, slow to react, easily managed." "The reports were wrong," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded, given how hard my heart was still pounding beneath my ribs. He tilted his head slightly, studying me a moment longer, and then, without warning, he stepped back from the doorway and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor beyond, leaving behind only the sound of the station's alarm and the ragged breathing of the two intruders still lying on my floor. I stood there for a long moment, the unfamiliar device still clutched in my hand, my mind racing to understand what had just happened and what it meant for everything that would come next. Whoever that tall figure had been, he had not come here expecting failure, and men who do not expect failure rarely give up simply because their first attempt did not succeed. Behind me, Yola finally emerged from her hiding place, her eyes wide as she looked around the wrecked remains of our small room, at the two fallen intruders, at the door hanging broken on its frame. "Elena," she said quietly, "this was not a simple attempt to take you somewhere. This was an operation. Someone planned this very carefully." "I know," I said, and I found myself already moving toward the broken doorway, drawn by a strange certainty that the night was far from finished, that whoever had sent that tall commanding figure would not simply walk away now that his first attempt had failed. And I intend to find out exactly who before this station sees sunrise again. Somewhere further down the corridor, the alarm continued to rise, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, I heard the sound of more footsteps gathering, more voices speaking in urgent, hurried tones. Whatever this operation had originally been planned to look like, it was quickly becoming something else entirely, and I intended to make certain that whoever had planned it would remember this night for the rest of their lives. I stepped through the broken doorway and into the corridor beyond. The weapon I did not yet fully understand held steady in my hand, and I let the old, quiet certainty that had carried me through every dangerous moment of my life guide my next steps forward into the dark. The corridor stretched out ahead of me, bathed in that same dim red emergency light, and for a moment I let myself stand still at the threshold of my broken doorway, listening. The alarm had not stopped its slow rising chime, but beneath it now I could hear something new, the low murmur of many voices gathering somewhere further down the station, urgent and overlapping, the sound of an operation trying to reorganize itself after its first plan had already fallen apart. I thought about my grandfather then, strange as it seems to say that in the middle of everything happening around me. He used to tell me stories when I was small, about the earliest humans who lived long before cities and lights and doors that locked with the press of a button. He said our ancestors survived, not because they were the strongest creatures walking the earth, and certainly not because they had claws or fangs or thick hides to protect them. They survived because they learned to notice everything, to plan 3 steps ahead, to turn fear into focus instead of letting it turn them into prey. He used to say that humanity carried that old knowledge in its bones, whether we remembered learning it or not. I had never truly believed him, not in any way that mattered, until tonight. I moved down the corridor slowly, keeping close to the wall, the unfamiliar device from the second intruder held ready in my hand, even though I still did not fully understand how to use it. Behind me, I heard Yola's soft footsteps following, and I raised a hand without turning to tell her to stay back, to stay close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. "You should not go further," she whispered, catching up anyway despite my signal. "Let station security handle this. Let them find whoever sent those people." Station security did not stop 3 intruders from walking straight into my room, I said quietly. "I do not think they will stop whatever is happening further down this corridor either." She did not argue after that, though I could hear the fear in her breathing, quick and shallow behind me. I understood her fear. I even respected it. But something in me had shifted since the moment that first hand reached toward my shoulder in the dark, and I no longer felt like the frightened specimen who had spent 2 years smiling politely at scientists and guards. I felt like something else now, something older, something that had been waiting quietly inside me my whole life for exactly this kind of night. The corridor bent sharply to the left ahead, leading toward the section of the station where the research wings gave way to the administrative offices, and beyond that, eventually, to the docking bay where ships came and went on their long journeys between the stars. If someone had planned to take me off this station entirely, that was almost certainly where they intended to bring me. I reached the bend and paused, pressing myself against the wall, listening again. The murmur of voices had grown louder, close enough now that I could pick out individual tones among them, sharp commands and hurried replies, the unmistakable sound of people trying to fix a plan that had already broken. I risked a glance around the corner. 5 more Halvins stood clustered near a junction of corridors perhaps 30 meters ahead, all of them armed with devices similar to the one in my hand, all of them listening to instructions from a 6th figure who stood slightly apart from the group. I recognized the shape of him immediately, tall and composed even in the chaos of the moment. It was the same commanding figure who had watched me from my own doorway only minutes before, the one who had called my species soft and easily managed and then walked away when the truth proved otherwise. I pulled back behind the corner, my mind working quickly. 5 armed opponents in an open corridor was not a fight I could win through speed and surprise, the way I had won against 3 intruders caught in the confined darkness of my own room. I needed to think differently now. I needed to use the station itself against them, the way I had once used the terrain of my grandfather's farm against every disadvantage life had thrown at me growing up. I thought about the layout of this section, memorized carefully over 2 long years of walking these same corridors under guard, always watched, always studied, never once suspected of paying attention to anything beyond what I was told to look at. There was a maintenance passage that ran parallel to this corridor, narrow and dark and rarely used, connecting to the main hallway through a service hatch perhaps 20 meters ahead of where the group was currently gathered. "There is another way," I whispered to Yola, pointing toward a narrow panel set low into the wall a short distance behind us, one I had noticed months ago, during a rare unsupervised walk back from the medical wing. "It leads to the same junction, but from a different direction." Her eyes widened. "How do you even know that is there?" "I pay attention," I said simply, and I felt a strange, quiet pride in the words, the same pride my grandfather must have felt every time he told me another story about the old ways humanity had survived long before anyone thought to write any of it down. We moved quickly and quietly to the panel, and I worked the release mechanism the way I had watched a maintenance worker do it once, months ago, never imagining I would need to remember the sequence for anything more important than curiosity. The panel slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow, dark passage barely wide enough for a single person to move through at a time. "Stay here," I told Yola, my voice low and firm. "If this goes wrong, get back to the medical wing and find someone you trust. Do not try to follow me." She looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her otherwise, because she simply nodded, her eyes bright with fear, and something else, something that looked almost like respect. I slipped into the narrow passage and let the panel close softly behind me, plunging myself into near total darkness broken only by the faint glow of distant service lights, spaced far apart along the ceiling. I moved forward carefully, one hand trailing along the wall to guide me, the device from the intruder still held ready in my other hand. The passage was tight and smelled faintly of recycled air and old metal, and I found myself thinking, absurdly, of the crawl spaces beneath my grandfather's old farmhouse, where I used to hide as a child during games that felt like the most important thing in the world at the time. I had never imagined that skill would matter again someday, moving quietly through cramped darkness while something dangerous searched for me on the other side of a thin wall. I reached the service hatch faster than I expected, and through the thin metal grating that covered it, I could see the junction beyond, the group of Halvins still gathered there, their voices now clearer than before. "Cannot report this failure," one of them was saying, his voice tight with something that sounded like fear. "If she reaches the administrative wing before we recover her, the whole operation collapses." "She is one small human," another voice replied, though it carried less confidence than the words themselves suggested. "5 of us, against one of her, this should not be difficult." "3 of us already failed," a third voice cut in sharply. "I do not believe this will be simple at all." The tall, commanding figure spoke then, his voice cutting through the others with quiet, controlled authority. "Enough. We know her likely path. She has no weapon beyond what she has taken from us, and no allies capable of aiding her beyond a frightened roommate who will not risk herself further. Spread out. Cover both approaches to the docking bay. She cannot avoid us forever." I felt a chill at his certainty, at how easily he dismissed everything I had already done to his operation as nothing more than a minor delay. But beneath the chill, I also felt something else, something sharper. He believed he understood me completely, believed the reports that called my species soft and predictable, and that belief was about to become the single greatest weakness in his entire plan. I studied the grating in front of me carefully, working out the release mechanism by touch in the dim light, and I began to plan. The junction ahead had 3 visible exits besides the one the group currently occupied, each leading toward a different section of the station. If they intended to spread out and cover the approaches to the docking bay, that meant most of them would soon be moving away from this position, leaving perhaps only 1 or 2 behind to guard the junction itself. I waited, my breathing slow and controlled, counting the seconds the way I had counted my own heartbeat back in my room before any of this began. Through the grating, I watched as the group began to split, 3 of them moving off toward the corridors leading deeper into the station, while 2 remained behind near the junction, along with the tall, commanding figure who simply stood watching, seemingly content to let his subordinates do the work while he oversaw the outcome from a distance. 2 guards and their commander. Better odds than 5, though still far from simple. I worked the release mechanism on the grating slowly, careful not to make any sound that might carry through to the junction beyond, and it finally gave way with a soft click, swinging open just enough for me to slip through into the shadows at the edge of the junction, hidden behind a support column that rose from floor to ceiling nearby. The 2 remaining guards stood with their backs partially turned to me, their attention focused on the corridors their companions had disappeared into, clearly expecting any threat to come from ahead rather than from behind. I understood, watching them, exactly how deeply this entire operation had underestimated me, and exactly how much that underestimation was about to cost them. I moved from the shadow of the column with the same quiet, controlled speed I had used against the intruders in my room, closing the distance to the nearest guard before he had any chance to sense my approach. My hand found the pressure point along the side of his neck that I had once read about in an old book from my grandfather's shelf, a technique meant for controlling rather than harming, and he crumpled silently to the floor before he could make any sound at all. The second guard turned at the faint noise of his companion falling, his eyes widening as he registered my presence far too late to properly react. I did not give him time to raise his device. I closed the remaining distance and used the same technique that had worked before, and he too went down quietly, leaving only the tall, commanding figure standing alone at the center of the junction. He turned slowly to face me, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "You continue to surprise me," he said finally, his voice quiet and measured, though I thought I detected something new beneath the calm, something that might have been the very first thread of genuine concern. The reports truly did not prepare me for this. "Then perhaps," I said, stepping closer, the device from the fallen guard still steady in my hand, "someone should have spent less time writing reports about my species and more time actually trying to understand us." He studied me a moment longer, his pale eyes moving over the fallen guards at my feet, over the calm, controlled way I stood, despite everything that had already happened tonight, and something in his posture shifted, the confidence I had first sensed from him beginning, finally, to crack. "Who sent you?" I asked again, the same question I had asked the very first intruder back in my room, though this time I asked it with far more certainty that I would receive an answer. He did not respond immediately, and I took another step closer, close enough now to see the fine details of his expression, the careful way he was calculating whether to answer honestly or attempt some final desperate move. I had seen that same calculation on the faces of every opponent tonight, and every single time, the calculation had ended the same way. "You should understand," he said slowly, "that this was never meant to be an act of harm. There are those among certain factions who believe your species represents something valuable, something worth studying far more closely than any research station could ever manage under the current agreements. I was hired to bring you somewhere more suited to that purpose." "Hired by whom?" I pressed, my voice steady despite the anger building quietly beneath my calm. He hesitated one final time, glancing toward the corridors where his remaining subordinates had disappeared, perhaps hoping for their return, perhaps simply buying himself a few more seconds to decide how much he was willing to reveal. But those seconds, like every other advantage his operation had once possessed tonight, had already run out. He moved faster than I expected, faster than anything he had shown me until that moment, his hand darting toward a small device hidden beneath the fold of his coat. I had spent the entire night learning to read the smallest signals before they became actions, and even so, he nearly caught me off guard, the device already halfway raised before I managed to knock it aside with a sharp strike against his wrist. It clattered to the floor and skittered away into the shadows beyond the junction, and for the first time all night, I saw something close to genuine alarm cross his face. "You should not have come here," I told him, my voice quiet but firm, the same steady calm that had carried me through everything since the moment my door first opened in the dark. "You should not have come for me at all." He stepped back, putting distance between us, his eyes moving quickly toward the corridors on either side, searching for some way out of a situation that had clearly stopped resembling anything he had planned for. I understood, watching him, that whatever confidence had brought him into my room tonight had finally, completely abandoned him. "The others will return soon," he said, though his voice had lost the calm certainty it carried only minutes before. "You cannot hold this position against all of us." "I do not need to hold it for very long," I said, and I meant it, because somewhere behind me, faint but growing steadily louder, I could finally hear the sound of proper station security moving through the corridors, drawn at last by the alarm that had been sounding since the very beginning of this long, strange night. He heard it too, and something in his expression shifted from alarm into something closer to resignation. He glanced once more toward the corridors where his remaining people had gone, clearly calculating whether there was still time to gather them and retreat before security arrived, and clearly realizing that time had already run out. "This is not finished," he said quietly, more to himself than to me, and then he turned and moved quickly toward the nearest corridor, disappearing into the shadows before I could decide whether to follow. I let him go. Chasing him further into the darkened station, alone, with security finally closing in from somewhere behind me, felt like exactly the kind of overconfidence that had already cost his own people so much tonight. I had learned enough for now. I knew there was a larger operation behind this. Factions willing to hire someone to remove me from a station I had never asked to live on in the first place. Someone who saw me not as a person, but as something valuable to be studied and controlled. That knowledge settled into me slowly, heavier than anything I had felt since this night began, heavier even than the fear that had first flickered through me when that hand reached toward my shoulder in the dark. It was one thing to defend myself against 3 intruders acting on someone else's orders. It was another thing entirely to understand that somewhere beyond this station, powerful people had decided my life was theirs to plan around without ever once asking what I wanted for myself. I knelt beside the 2 guards still unconscious near my feet, checking quickly to confirm they were breathing steadily, unharmed beyond what would fade with time. Whatever they had been sent to do tonight, I found I had no desire to cause them any lasting harm. My anger, when it finally arrived in full, was not aimed at these frightened young men who had simply followed orders. It was aimed at whoever had given those orders in the first place, safely distant from any of the danger their plan had ultimately created. Footsteps approached quickly from the corridor behind me, and I turned to see a group of station security officers rounding the bend, their weapons raised cautiously as they took in the scene before them. 2 fallen guards on the floor and a single human girl standing calmly at the center of it all. "Step away from them," one of the officers called out, his voice tense, with the same uncertainty I had seen on every alien face tonight, the uncertainty of someone confronting something they had never expected to see. "I already have," I said, raising my hand slowly to show I carried nothing but the small device I had taken from the fallen guard, setting it gently onto the floor in front of me. "There are more of them further down that corridor, and a man in charge who ran when he heard you coming. You should hurry if you want to catch him." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the calm, measured way I spoke, so different from whatever panicked reaction they must have expected to find. One of them finally lowered his weapon slightly and moved forward, kneeling beside the 2 fallen guards to check on their condition, while another spoke quickly into a communicator clipped to his shoulder, requesting additional support to search the surrounding corridors. Yola appeared then, hurrying around the same bend the officers had come from, her eyes searching frantically until they found me standing safely at the center of the junction. Relief flooded across her face so completely that I felt something in my own chest loosen for the first time since the lights had gone out. "You are safe," she breathed, rushing to my side, despite the cautious officers still working around us. I heard the alarms grow louder, and I thought, "I am safe," I confirmed, and I found, to my own surprise, that I believed it completely. The senior officer among the group approached me slowly, his expression a careful mixture of professional caution and something that looked almost like awe. "You will need to come with us for questioning," he said. "This was clearly a planned incursion, and Station Command will want a full account of everything that happened tonight." "I intend to give them one," I said, and I meant it, because somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the exhaustion finally beginning to settle over me, now that the immediate danger had passed, a new kind of resolve was already taking shape. Whoever had planned this operation, whoever had decided my life belonged to them to arrange as they saw fit, needed to understand exactly what kind of mistake they had made tonight. As the officers moved to secure the 2 fallen guards and continue their search of the surrounding corridors, I allowed myself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. My hands, which had remained so steady throughout the entire confrontation, began to tremble slightly now that there was nothing left to fight. My legs felt suddenly heavy, the adrenaline that had carried me through every dangerous moment tonight finally beginning to fade, leaving something rawer and more honest in its place. Yola noticed immediately, reaching out to steady me with a gentle hand on my arm. "You did something extraordinary tonight," she said quietly, her voice full of a wonder I had never heard from her before. "I do not think anyone on this station will ever look at you the same way again." I thought about that as the officers led us both slowly back through the corridors toward the administrative wing, past the wreckage of my broken doorway, past the places where 3, then 5, then 6 armed strangers had each, in turn, discovered exactly how wrong their assumptions about me had been. I thought about the tall, commanding figure who had escaped into the darkness, still out there somewhere with knowledge I desperately wanted, knowledge about who had truly sent him and why. And beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear finally catching up to me now that it was safe to feel it, I found something else waiting quietly underneath, something steady and certain that I recognized from every story my grandfather had ever told me about the earliest humans standing in tall grass, watching shadows move through the darkness around them, and choosing, every single time, not to become prey. Whatever came next, whoever had planned this operation and whatever they still intended to do, I understood now, with complete and total clarity, that they would need to plan for a very different version of me than the one their reports had described. The administrative wing looked entirely different at night than it did during the long, ordinary days I had spent walking its halls under careful supervision for the past 2 years. Every light seemed brighter now, every corridor sharper and more exposed, as though the station itself had been shaken awake by everything that happened and had not yet settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. They brought me to a small room near the center of the wing, plain and functional, with a single table and a handful of chairs arranged around it. A senior officer named Garrick sat across from me, his expression carefully neutral in the way I had learned, over 2 years, meant he was working very hard to hide exactly how unsettled he truly felt. "Walk me through everything," he said, his voice steady despite the tension I could sense underneath it, from the moment the lights went out. So I did. I told him about the shift in the air, the change in the hum of the station, the footsteps outside my door that moved too carefully to belong to anyone with honest intentions. I told him about the 3 intruders who slipped into my room expecting an easy, quiet victory, and about the moment I opened my eyes and everything changed. I told him about Yola, about the broken door, about the tall, commanding figure who watched from a distance and called my species soft before learning otherwise. Garrick listened without interrupting, though I watched his expression shift slowly from professional caution into something closer to genuine astonishment as the story continued. By the time I reached the junction, the 2 guards who fell without ever raising their weapons, the commanding figure who fled into the darkness rather than face me directly, his composure had cracked entirely, replaced by an expression I recognized from every single alien I had encountered that night. Disbelief, slowly giving way to something that looked almost like respect. "You disabled 6 trained operatives," he said finally, using nothing but a chair leg and whatever weapons you managed to take from them along the way. "I did what was necessary to protect myself and my roommate," I said simply. Nothing more than that. He studied me for a long moment, and then he set down the small recording device he had been using to document our conversation, leaning back slightly in his chair. "The reports on your species describe humans as physically unremarkable, slow reflexes compared to most spacefaring races, limited natural defenses. I confess, Elena, that after tonight, I am beginning to wonder how much of what we believed about your people was ever accurate at all." "Very little of it, I suspect," I said, and for the first time since the lights had gone out hours before, I felt something close to a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Earth was never a gentle world. Everything that lived there learned to survive dangers your species can barely imagine, long before we ever built our first ship to leave it behind. I think perhaps your reports only ever measured the parts of us that were easy to see. They never measured what was underneath. Garrick was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked the question I had been waiting for since our conversation began. Did the one who called himself your would-be captor say anything more before he escaped? Any name, any indication of who hired him? I told him what little I knew, the vague mention of factions who saw value in studying my species more closely than any research agreement currently allowed, the certainty in the commander's voice that this had never been meant as an act meant to cause me harm, only an act meant to take control of my life without ever asking my permission. It was not much, but Garrick assured me it was more than enough for Station Command to begin a proper investigation, one that would stretch far beyond the walls of this single research facility. By the time the questioning finally ended, the artificial night cycle of the station had already begun shifting toward morning, the corridors outside slowly filling with the ordinary sounds of a station waking up to a day that would be anything but ordinary. Word of what happened had already begun spreading. the way word always does on a station this size, whispered between crew members in hushed, disbelieving tones. I stepped out of the administrative wing to find Yola waiting for me exactly where she promised she would be, her expression a mixture of relief and something new, something that had not been there before tonight. "They are already talking about you all over the station," she said, as we walked together back toward what remained of our quarters, now sealed off, while maintenance crews repaired the broken door. "Some of them do not believe it happened the way it did. They think the reports must be exaggerated." "Let them believe what they want," I said, and I found I meant it completely. I had spent 2 years trying to convince the people on this station that I deserved to be seen as more than a curiosity, more than a specimen to be measured and studied and quietly contained. I had never expected that the thing which finally changed their perception would be a night of violence I never wanted and never asked for. We passed several crew members in the corridor who stopped and stared as we walked by, their whispers falling silent the moment they noticed me watching. I recognized some of the same faces that had once looked at me with polite, distant curiosity, the careful kind of attention reserved for something interesting but ultimately harmless. Now their expressions carried something else entirely, a wariness I had never seen directed at me before, mixed uncomfortably with something that looked almost like admiration. I understood, walking through that changed silence, that I would never again be simply the human guest of the Halvan Cultural Exchange Program. Whatever I had been to this station before tonight, I had become something else entirely in the span of a single sleepless hour, and there was no returning to what came before. Later that day, after a brief and uneasy rest, I was called back to the administrative wing to meet with a higher-ranking official I had never spoken with directly before, a woman named Director Assel, who oversaw the entire research program that had brought me to this station in the first place. She sat across from me with none of Garrick's careful neutrality, her expression open and direct in a way that surprised me. "I want to be honest with you," she said, folding her hands carefully on the table between us. "This station failed you last night. Whatever agreement brought you here, it was never meant to include the possibility that someone might try to take you against your will. That failure sits with us, not with you." I appreciated her honesty more than I expected to. "What happens now?" "An investigation, thorough and far-reaching, into whoever arranged last night's incident," she said, "and a re-evaluation of the protections offered to you and to any other human guests who may eventually join our programs. You proved something valuable last night, Elena, whether you intended to or not. You proved that the assumptions guiding how this station, and likely many others, understands your species were dangerously incomplete." I thought about that for a long moment, about all the whispered conversations that used to fall silent whenever I entered a room, all the careful notes written about my strange, resilient body, all the quiet assumptions that had painted humanity as something fragile, something easily managed, something that could be studied and contained without consequence. "Good," I said finally, "because I think it is long past time the rest of the galaxy understood exactly what kind of world Earth truly was, and exactly what kind of people it raised." Director Assel studied me for a moment, and something in her expression shifted into what looked almost like respect. "The footage from the corridor cameras has already reached several other stations along this trade route," she admitted. "It seems your name is becoming known rather quickly, in circles far beyond this facility." I was not entirely sure how I felt about that, about the idea of strangers across the stars watching recordings of the worst night of my life, forming their own opinions about who I was and what I represented. But beneath the uncertainty, I also felt something steadier, something that resembled the quiet pride my grandfather always carried when he told his old stories about humanity's long, difficult road toward survival. Perhaps it was not such a terrible thing, I thought, for the galaxy to finally begin understanding the truth about Deathworlders, one recording, one whispered story, one changed perception at a time. That evening, as the station cycled slowly back toward its usual night lighting, I stood alone in the newly repaired doorway of my quarters, looking out at the corridor, where everything had begun less than 24 hours before. The chair leg that had served me so well was gone now, replaced along with the rest of the broken furniture, but I found I remembered exactly how it had felt in my hand, exactly how steady my grip had been, despite everything happening around me. Yola joined me quietly, standing beside me in the doorway without speaking for a long moment. "Are you afraid they will try again?" she finally asked. I considered the question carefully before answering. "I imagine they will. Whoever hired that commander tonight, whoever believes I represent something valuable enough to risk an operation like the one we survived, I do not think people like that give up easily after a single failure. And are you afraid of that?" I thought about the tall, commanding figure disappearing into the shadows, about the quiet certainty in his voice when he said this was not finished. I thought about my grandfather's stories, about tall grass and old instincts, and the long, difficult history that shaped every human who ever lived on a world that never once made survival easy. "No," I said finally, and I found the word carried more truth than I expected. Whoever comes next will simply have to learn the same lesson everyone learned tonight. Humanity was never as soft as anyone believed, and I do not intend to let anyone forget that again. The corridor lights dimmed further as the station settled into its proper night cycle, and somewhere far beyond these walls, across the vast distances between the stars, I knew that whoever had planned tonight's failed operation was already beginning to plan whatever would come next. Let them plan, I thought, standing steady in the quiet darkness of a doorway that had nearly become my undoing only a day before. I had survived Deathworlds long before I ever left the one I was born on, and I would survive whatever came for me, here among the stars as well.